But
I don't know if she knows that. I mean, a little bit.
we're good to go.
Are we ready?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now we can really know that it's everything we say.
The first European man to come into the valley was Dominguez and Escalante in 1776, early October of 1776. That was the first, that's the first recorded history of European man in this area. And then of course the old Spanish Trail and the old wagon roads used to come through here too after that. But the first exploration in here was that, well, they'd had Jedediah Strong Smith was an early trapper that came down into this country and ended up in California and then came back in northern Utah. And he was killed as we came back into Utah. So that was an exploration, but that was mainly for fur trappers. But the Mormons knew about the iron. So they had this expedition, this over the rim party that left Salt Lake in 1849, and they always traveled in the fall and the winter. And I never could understand that. Why would you do that with the cold and all that? But they waited until they got their crops in and everything was done. Then they could do their exploration after that. So they came down, essentially, they came down the freeway, the I-15 corridor. They sent one group down through the valley and into St. George. That's where the book got its name, Over the Rim. The rim of the Great Basin is, well, it's right there. And that's what they were talking about. So they did that, and then the other party stopped here, Parley Pratt, because he was an engineer. And he came over and looked at the iron mines here, and they mapped that. And then they got back together in Parowan after that Over the Rim party met with them. And then Parley P. Pratt and somebody else started for Salt Lake in the spring of 1850, went to the legislature. The legislature gave them money. Then they sent this party again, and I think Isaac Haight was again in it, and that's when they came and settled Parowan in 1850 or 51, right? But that was the Over the Rim party, was the exploration of this area. Went back to legislatures, this is what we found. They were concerned about farming in Parowan because they didn't think crops would grow in those red soils. But obviously they do. So that's basically the story of the exploration of this area. And then, of course, as you said, Parowan was settled first, and then they came to Cedar and settled second, and then they started the iron mines, and they were not successful. They abandoned them. So the people that stayed were the people that developed the livestock industry and the farming here. And then that's the way that came about. But it had to have been sagebrush and grass. And you know, in those days, the Indians used to burn a lot. So you'd have some areas that were pure sagebrush, another area that was pure grassland, but there was much more grass than there is today. But the story they tell, when they came into the bottom of the valley out here, they had to be careful that they didn't bog their horses down in the meadows. see, that was before we started tapping the water. And so there was a lot of water on the surface, and that was one of the problems that they had as they came through the valley.
So what would the grasses have been?
The same thing we've got now, probably a lot of that Great Basin wild rye, probably a little bit of blue bunch wheatgrass, the poas, mutton grass, those kinds of things, Indian rice grass, needle and thread, same stuff we've got today.
Okay. Right.
But there was a lot of sagebrush down in those valleys, and the main sagebrush was this basin big sage. And basin big sage was used by the pioneers to indicate good farmland. So most of it is gone, and the only place you see it now when you're in the valley is on the fence lines. You know, some of that stuff is still 10 feet tall.
So what are the things that we see now that are, I guess, invaders?
Cheatgrass would be one, some of the annual hordeums or the foxtails.
Okay.
Annual rye that they planted for forage and for making rye bread.
Is that agripyron, or are there any native agripyron?
There would have been blue bunch wheatgrass, but it's not very common. I have to hunt for it nowadays. It probably was more important then. But yeah, it would have been here.
Okay.
And there's one they used to call wheatgrass. And I remember over at Ron Williams' place on Canary Mountain, he used to talk about wheatgrass. Well, it wasn't a wheatgrass, it was that Great Basin wild rye. In fact, if I'm careful, I can find it here for you, and I'll show it. It's that great big bunch grass. You know, it's about 5 feet tall and about 1 meter in diameter. Oh, that's an awful thing to see, those dead trees. That's happened since about 1990, Tom. And we don't know why. I've got the idea that it was a drought that hit in 83 and then several years after that. And then those trees started to die.
But there's that spot up there on the
Right.
top where
Mm-hmm.
they're not. Or
That's
why
right.
There? Why?
We don't know.
Okay.
We don't know why it is. We think sometimes it's they're more, that the ones that don't sucker or survive are not very palatable. We think a lot of those that don't sucker are cut down by cattle, sheep, and elk. Elk are terrible on aspen reproduction. So, but we really don't know. That we've got more questions than we got answers. But you can see the result of what happened in the early 90s, late 80s. It was about the same time that all those spruce trees on the mountain died.
Yeah.
And that's why I think it was drought. Killed both of them at the same time. I want to educate you as best I can on your legacy here. See those trailers over there?
Yeah.
On that mountain? At one time, they pulled those trailers over there to park them in the shade of the aspen. And now look at it. All of the aspen has died. We did some studies up here on how much elk and, well, mainly elk, did how much use elk made of aspen. See those big trees? At one time, those big trees were all over that fenced area. And see those smaller aspen? They have all come in after we clear cut that and got it. Aspen does not reproduce from seed. It reproduces from suckers from the roots. And that was one of our study areas. See, and that was the other thing that we appreciated. You guys let us do those kinds of things, that we could do some vegetation manipulation. And if you went in there, you would see. Yeah, there were two ways that this mountain became private land. One was through the Homestead Acts.
Yeah.
And there were 3 of those acts. There were 4, actually 4. And then they could, like Frank in those old days, he could have gone to the state and said, I want to buy that land up there. So the state would then go to the federal government and say, okay, that's part of our holdings from the Enabling Act, and we're going to get it. And then they got it, and then Frank would give them the money and buy it. And that, so there are 2 ways. Buying it from the state. See, when we became a state, 1/9 of the entire land base in Utah was given to the state for schools and other purposes. The federal penitentiary, the deaf and dumb school, the miners hospital, the school of mines, all those different things. But you know, this area that we're driving on right now, this is one of the largest tracts of privately owned mountain land in the state. 1862 was the passage of the Homestead Acts, the railroad grants, and those. But anyway, the first Homestead Act that was in the Plains states was 160 acres. And that was fine for Texas, Oklahoma, you know, Kansas and places. Then as we got farther west, the land got less productive. Then they had the enlarged Homestead Act, 320 acres. Then they had the 3-year Homestead Act. Didn't change the acreage, but they could just had to homestead it for 3 years. Then in 1916 they passed the grazing, livestock grazing. That's not really the name of it. I'm not doing it. Well, it was the Grazing Homestead Act, I think it's called. And then that gave them 640 acres a square mile. And I think old Lehigh Jones told me that he got some land out by 8 Mile through that Homestead Act. So it depended on which act was in effect.
Was in action.
Yeah. Now this is what we call a co-op pasture. This, when they, you know, the sheep thing over the bullock drug.
Right.
This was the headquarters when they combined all their sheep and all their land.
So all of this area through here, you think it naturally would have been grass?
No, I think it was tall forbs. I think that place, that Munford place, shows us what this mountain would have been in the 18th. See that, as I remember, Jill, you correct me if I'm wrong, that they first came up here with their livestock about 1863 or 64.
It was pretty late, yeah.
Something like that, until they could overcome the hostility of the Native Americans and the bears and lions that were up here. Then they started to come up. And
So when you say lions, do you mean cougars?
cougars, yeah. Bears probably more of a problem with their cattle, their dairy cattle, than the mountain lions were.
are you a range scientist?
That's a very interesting question. I'm asked that all the time. First of all, people will ask me if I'm from Utah, and I am, but I was born and raised over in Carbon County. They said that was the only place in the state of Utah that you could grow up as a Mormon and be a minority, and it was absolutely true. So anyway, my first job, just before I went in the service, was in the coal mines. I was working on the tipple, not in the mine. But there was me, and there was my father, and there was his father, and there was his father. That was 4 generations, maybe even 5 generations of Bownses near Almy, Wyoming. That's near Evanston. And then they moved from Evanston to near Price, a little town of Castle Gate. So you ask well, you know, most people in my profession grew up with livestock like you did, had property and that sort of thing. But I was a lot different than that. But the reason I got in this business is I like to be outdoors. This is my favorite thing to do is just exactly what we're doing today. I went into the Navy during the Korean War, and when I got out of that, I had the GI Bill, so I wanted to go to school. Well, I changed majors. I was going to go into electrical engineering because I was an electrician, aviation electrician in the Navy. Well, that didn't work out. And then I finally decided, well, the one thing I enjoy in life is to be in the outdoors. So I went into range management. And my objective when I went into range management was to work for the Forest Service because that's the only thing I knew. And I had an uncle that was a forest ranger. He grew up in Ephraim, typical type ranger. His dad was a small livestockman and farmer. And he gave me a job after I got out of the service, and which he shouldn't have done because that was nepotism, but he did anyway. Thank goodness that he did. And he said, "What are you going to major in?" I said, "I'm going to major in forestry." Forestry. He worked for the Forest Service at the time, and he said, I can tell you everything you need to know about trees in 10 minutes. You go into range management," which I did. And I got a bachelor's degree, and then I had an opportunity to go to the Forest Service if I wanted to, which was my original goal anyway. And then I also had an opportunity to go to graduate school. And I was not the greatest scholar in the world, and I had some apprehensions about that, but I did. I got a master's degree, and then I worked for a while with the Division of Wildlife Resources, and then I had the very unique opportunity to come down to Cedar City and take a job at the university and handle the range program, which I did. And I worked a couple of years, 4 or 5 years, and then went back to school, got a PhD, and then stayed down here. And my objective was to stay here for a few years and then go to something bigger and better. And the longer I stayed here, the more I enjoyed this country, the people, the land. And I started to teach here in January 1965. And if I can count at all, that's about 48 years that I've been here. And I'm still teaching a little bit. I'm officially retired, but I do this as part of my job. I also help teach some of the classes, and so I still do the same things that I did many years ago. about 1972, early 1970s, we were having predation problems, particularly up here. And I had a friend who owned sheep and owned private land, and I remember going with him, and we'd find an old smelly carcass, and he says, "That's a cougar kill." And I wouldn't say anything, and then next time he'd see a dead sheep and he'd say, "And that's a coyote kill." And finally I had to ask him, I said, "Now how do you know that? That thing stinks so bad you can't get close to it." And so there wasn't much written on it. So I proposed a study that I work with these local sheepmen, and one of those areas was Thorley's property over here at Miners Peak. And my objective was to find these animals that were dead. And it was at a time when there was a lot of particularly coyote predation. And what I would do, those animals are distinct in the way they kill. A coyote will usually attack lambs, and they bite like this. And people say, well, the reason they bite like that is they sever the jugular vein. Well, if you know anatomy at all, you know that the jugular and the carotid artery are between my thumb, the lower jaw, and my fingers, the upper jaw. And the way that coyote kills is he collapses the trachea and the animal suffocates. Cougars, on the other hand, are much larger, stronger, bigger jaws, and they come down on the top like this and snap the neck, break the neck. Bears just totally mutilate the animal and eat everything. Domestic dogs, which is a problem near towns, we still have that problem around Cedar City. Dogs are a little like bears. They tend to mutilate the carcasses. They will hamstring them. They will tear out their intestines, those kinds of things. So I found that to be a very interesting study, and I published on that, have some colored pictures that show those different things. And then we tried to figure out what how many animals had been killed. What was the mortality? As we've been sitting here, you noticed a pickup truck drive by here with a horse in the back. That's the government trapper. There was a government trapper here when I was doing studies 40 years ago, and they're still up here. He's up here probably hunting coyotes that are killing sheep. So I found that to be intriguing. And then what made it really interesting was in 1972, President Nixon banned the use of all predators or all toxicants used in predator control. And those main things were 1080, which was a toxin that was developed by the Polish during World War II, brought into the United States shortly after World War II, and then cyanide and strychnine. So that changed the whole complexion of predator control. And then the very next year, then we found that Nixon, where the EPA, not Nixon this time, but the EPA canceled the registration of all toxicants used in predator control. Now, that's fine, and I like that historical part of it. But one thing that we have noticed up here, and particularly on Thorley's place, that was probably the premier deer hunting place that I knew, and I started hunting deer in 1949. I didn't ever hunt over there because I had another place and I didn't want to bother them anyway. But you go over there now and I understand that deer numbers are quite rare. The numbers started to crash about 1975. Well, if we banned the toxicants in 72 and 3, and then the deer numbers started to crash in 1975, it seems like there must be some correlation between the ban on the toxicants and the demise of the deer herds, because they have just steadily declined since the early 1970s. So that was a study that I found very interesting and I thought very productive. I'll try to keep my hands away from We came over here because it was private land, and we thought we could and were able to work cooperatively with the Parse Webster and J. Thorley families, and it turned out really well. There were 2 adjacent properties, Miner's Peak, which is right there. The spine of that peak is the boundary for Webster's, and then they border the Thorley family right down this drainage right here. So, and the boundaries had already been fenced. But in those days, they used to just have basically one large pasture, and then the sheep would run through that. When we designed this study, we needed 18 pastures. And so that required a lot of fencing, and that was expensive, but of course the expense was that was handled by Utah State University. That was a project there. There were 2 of us that were called project leaders. I was the range or vegetation project leader, and Darrell Matthews, who's deceased, was the animal science project leader. And I don't remember how many animals we had. When we wanted to study the effects of sheep grazed alone and also grazed with cattle, cattle grazed alone and with sheep, obviously, and then we wanted those grazed under 2 grazing systems or grazing methods, one called deferred rotation, which simply means we brought the animals up. We would pair the pastures. We would bring the animals up into one pasture. They would stay there until about the 1st of August, and then we would transfer them to or rotate them into another pasture. And that's the way this study was done. And we had 18 pastures, and we had, thousands of animals by the time we got the lambs and the ewes and the cows and the calves. So it was a very intensive project. And as I mentioned before, what made it nice for me was being able to hire local students from the university, which provided them with a summer job and also allowed them some experience with research and and working in the outdoors. We had to have some areas up here where there was no livestock grazing. So we had to fence these ourselves and exclude the sheep and the cattle. And it's pretty hard to exclude deer and elk, but the livestock, we had to exclude them. So we measured the vegetation in those areas and outside. So we would bring the animals up here about the middle of June, depending on the year. And then all of those animals, every cow, every calf, every ewe, every lamb, had to be weighed individually. So we brought them up, we weighed them all, we put them in their respective pastures. And then when we rotated, about the 1st of August, then we had to weigh them all again. And we're talking about thousands of animals, running them on a scale and recording those weights. And then about the middle of October, we would take the animals off the project and we would have to weigh them again. So that's what made it such an intensive study. And then from my perspective, I had to measure the vegetation here all summer long to see what the changes were going to be, if any, with those different combinations of animals and the rotation and the continuous grazing. And so we were up here from the middle of June until literally till the snow drove us off in the fall, because with those fences, those 18 pastures, we had about 20 miles of fence. And the fences up here, you can't just build a fence and then forget about it. When we come up in the spring, we have to walk that 20 miles and hang the fences. They're called let-down fences. We put them up on the posts, and then when we leave in the fall, then we have to walk all that 20 miles again and lay those fences down. You don't see those things very often, that kind of a study, because of the expense of fencing, the expense of the labor, and all of those things. So we will probably never see another study like that. And then we produced 2 extensive studies, capstone studies, one looking at the effects, what the effects were on the animals, the cows, calves, ewes, and lambs, and what happened with the vegetation, what changes took place in that. Can't remember exactly the number of years, 10 or 12 years. And it gained a lot of notoriety throughout the West, because we had people coming in here literally from all of the western states to see this study and see what we were doing and what we were finding out. So, and we could not have done this had it not been for the cooperation of these 2 families. They're 2 very important families in this general area that have been in the livestock business for many, many decades. So we were very fortunate to have this opportunity to do this and have the cooperation of these people. And we also the fact that we were able to help students out with their expenses and their experiences. So that was what we did here for several years and all summer long.
But several years to the tune of 25 years?
Well, I'm trying to think how many, Jill, it was. We started here in, I guess the first data was in 1980, and I guess we probably had, 20 years. Maybe it was 20 years. all in all, it was, I guess you could say it was a classic study in range management on the mountain ranges in the West, and that's the way it was interpreted and the way it was evaluated. So. But overgrazing is a touchy thing to look at. It's not as simple as you might think. But I don't think this property and even Webster's on this side of the peak are two of the best properties, along with a few of Ellick's, and some of those were pastures that he bought from one of the Thorleys. There were some areas that were overgrazed, but this one was not one. Now, does that mean I can't find a place here that could be improved? Yeah, I can. But for the most part, this is still great range. Another thing you might do, if we could do it, is switch from sheep to cattle. And by doing that, you would see a change. Because you can use domestic livestock to manipulate vegetation. You could do it several ways. You could do it like we did and graze sheep and cattle together at the same time. Or you could say, okay, I'll graze it with sheep for 5 years, and then I'll graze it with cattle for 5 years. There is a place, let's see, I gotta remember where I'm talking about. You know where Webster Flat is? Up by the sand cuts. There's a place there, there's a fence that runs down like this. And Clark's run cattle here, and Nelson's run sheep here. Okay, where the cattle are, there's an abundance of snowberry and less grass. And then when I go to Nelson's sheep range, I see no snowberry, but mainly grass. And that's what you can do by changing the livestock. And I tried to get the Forest Service to go to common use grazing, graze them both at the same time, or I wouldn't want to graze, let's say, sheep for, I would say 10 years, because animals are creatures of habit, and they get used to a particular pasture. But in there, I'd say, okay, Clark's, I'm going to put the sheep in here for 10 years, and you're going to go over on Nelson's in that grass. And then after 10 years, we're going to shift it. And you can manipulate the vegetation that way, how you want to do it. But it's amazing. You can stand right there on that fence and see a tremendous difference in those. Do you remember going over there, Jill, when you were in school? You don't have that problem here. You don't have that distinct vegetation type. The other thing you have here, you have a lot of shrubs, snowberry, and different things like that. And you have a lot of grasses, and you have a lot of forbs. And when you go over there at that co-op pasture that I know was overgrazed 100 years ago at least, what you see there is predominantly grass because of the long history of sheep use. So there are lots of things you can do, manipulate the vegetation. If sometime you decide, well, we've had sheep on here long enough, I want to see a change, then you could go to cattle, and you can do that here because there's a plant called tall larkspur that'll kill your cows. You don't have it. So you've got lots of options. That's why we were able to run cattle in here like we did. The nice thing about grazing cattle and sheep together is sheep use one kind of plant, particularly snowberry, and I don't see it here, but you got a lot of it on this place. The sheep will eat the snowberry, cows won't touch it. And so by using both sheep and cattle, you're using all kinds of vegetation on all parts of the pasture. And that's the advantage. And you know, people will say, well, a cow, a respectable cow, will never graze where a stinking sheep has been. That is total nonsense. Because cattle and sheep, well, all four of them, deer, elk, cattle, and sheep are extremely compatible in here. And that's why you've got all four of them. So, and that's the other thing that I like about your place is you got that diversity. Diversity of grasses, diversity of shrubs, all those different things. That's what makes it such a good range. So it's good for wildlife, it's good for sheep, it's good for deer, it's good for Thorleys, I think. When we started this study on the mountain, we had to know what the stocking rate was. And the stocking rate is based on two things. It's based on the number of animals that you're going to graze and how long you're going to graze them. And we had no clue when we come up here how we were going to graze it. So I looked at ranchers that had been in this country all their lives, and the ranges and what condition they were in. And I selected an old gentleman by the name of Williams. Alec, yeah, Alec Williams. And there was Alec and his sons, Tom and Warren, that were running both sheep and cattle up here. So we had both. We needed to have both. So I needed to know how many animals they grazed, what the acreage was of the pastures they grazed, and how long they were in there. So knowing that, then we decided on what we called then an initial stocking rate. And that's what a stocking rate is. It's initial. Because you start with it, you stock, and then you evaluate. And so we stocked it, and when I was conservative at the time, I didn't want to overgraze this country at all. Particularly didn't want to overgraze. So we stocked it and we evaluated it the next year, and I was looking at the response to the vegetation, and then the other, my partner, Darryl Matthews, was looking at the animals, and he was looking at animal performance. So we had to kind of, between the two of us, decide what we were going to do. So we ended up with a stocking rate for these pastures. And remember, we had 18 different pastures. So we had and there were different carrying capacities, different range conditions, so we had to take that into consideration. You have to remember there's quite a difference between a cow and a sheep. And so we use the cow. We have a concept that is an animal unit month, or an AUM. That's the way we talk about animals on a range. And an animal unit month is defined as the amount of forage it takes, is required for a 1,000-pound cow and her calf up to 6 months of age for 1 month. And it varies between authors in the profession of range management, but the last book I used, they used 2%. In other words, an animal, a 1,000-pound cow, would eat 2% of her body weight. And what that amounts to is 20 pounds per day, 600 pounds per month would be an animal unit month. So that's what we used. And then that's fine, that's for cows. And then there is another concept, and those are equivalents between the different animals. In other words, an equivalent for a deer is different than an antelope, is different than an elk, is different than a horse, is different than a buffalo. And with sheep, we say, okay, an animal unit now. An animal unit is a 1,000-pound cow, remember. So an animal unit for sheep is 5. In other words, 5 sheep and 2 lambs up to weaning, which is about 6 months of age. That is an animal unit. So we made those calculations, and that's what we used. If we saw during the period of that study that we felt we were overstocked or even understocked, we could adjust. But basically then what we started out with, we had an animal unit month, a 1,000-pound cow and her calf up to 6 months of age for 1 month, or 5 ewes and 10 lambs for a month. And that's the way we calculated the stocking rate, and that was the stocking rate that we used here. During the period of that study, I would have people come to me and say, I've got some pasture and I want to lease it out, and this guy wants to rent it. What should I do? What should the stocking rate be? So I always did that same thing. I said, okay, I need to know your acreage. I need to know the time you're going to be on there, and then which kind of animal. And we did that for a lot of people on this mountain. I was comfortable with 5 sheep to 1 cow, and the stocking rate that I recommended for most people still do on this mountain is about 4 acres per cow per month, or the equivalent in sheep, and that's the way we determined the stocking rate.
So 4 AUM.
Look right down there.
Okay.
See
and
that?
That's
that riparian wheatgrass. Now look how those little mounds are rounded.
Yeah.
When I came up here, my recollection is that there were some active gullies all through here. Now the gullies have rounded off on the shoulders, haired in the bottom. They're not carrying sediment. The water is just running down there gently. And so
Well, that's my recollection too.
yeah, that is it is not the best grass for forage. It's a little tough, but boy, I'll take it anytime, because it does stabilize your soils. And I think it's very attractive, that blue color. There's a good indication, Colleen, that at one time this was overgrazed because it cut gullies down through here. But you can see that's not the condition now, because those gullies are healed up almost completely, if not completely. And if you went in there, you would see grass just like this. And this is what I mean in trying to tell Colleen is, this is good range condition. You can hardly see the soil. You got all these good grasses, things. You got deer, you got elk, you got livestock. I don't know what more you would want. And what you have here is, in my judgment, very good condition. But look at the grass that's in here, and this is a year where we got just barely more than half of the precipitation for this time of year. Now that says something about this place and how resilient it is. We had a year, 1989, was the driest year I can ever remember. And I had both Carol and Casey helping me collect data at that time. And the grasses weren't even green. They looked like that Poa Bobosa, yeah. But they just, it was just terrible the way it looked. But the next year, or next few years, it came back right to normal. That's what we call resilience in these stands.
It's got to be one of the most beautiful places on earth.
You're absolutely right. This isn't, to me, this doesn't impress me much. But when I get over to your place on the east side of the Miners Peak, that's the country I like.